so excited that our partnership with the Missouri History Museum continues, and she is back, ladies and gentlemen. Cecily Hunter, public historian with the African American History Initiative at the Missouri Historical Society. Welcome back.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Talk to me about what before we get into the story of the Modiste, which a word I've only heard on certain older geographical shows.
Yeah.
I've never used, we don't use Modiste anymore,
yes.
right? But we'll talk about it in just a second. But what is the African American History Initiative?
So essentially, we have a number of pillars. So one of them is to continue to share the story of Black experiences in St. Louis. We want to continue to diversify the field. So that more people are seeing themselves represented in that field, not only in MHS, but also across the country. We want to continue to expand our collection. So what that looks like is, if you know that you have something, an artifact, a moving image, so that could be family movies, that could be, that could be 3D objects, or if you have photographs or what have you, and you're like, hey, I want this to live in perpetuity, and I want somebody to preserve that history. You contact us, we show up, and we have conversations. The staff gets together and they assess, if this should be brought into our collection. And if it makes it through that streamline, then it becomes a part of our collection. Can
I just right now pitch the idea? Because this is being recorded. I want to pitch the idea of it's like Antique Roadshow, which you can see here on PBS, on 9 PBS, but it's artifacts.
Yes.
The African American experience, St. Louisans. What Black artifacts do you have?
Yes.
Bring them. We just have a day, a weekend, and see what we get.
Yeah, so there's lots of conversations that we hope to have with the community members. In particular, I'm working on an exhibit about the Ville neighborhood. And so it's scheduled to open in 2028. So we are particularly excited about reaching out to former, Ville residents. Yeah, and then even those who live there currently or frequent the neighborhood for going to churches or different institutions. We're all about hearing those stories and also seeing what people have, because we want, when that exhibit opens up, for people to see all of the things related to the Ville neighborhood and how life was like for the average person, for those who rose to prominence across the country, across the world, right? Tina Turner, and you got Dick Gregory, like all of these acclaimed names that we know of and that we love in our St. Louis community. But we want to be able to showcase that. And what better way to do that than for people to be able to come to the space, and also for those to donate.
Stay tuned, as they say.
Yes, for sure.
I love those plans, and I'm putting myself in the middle of it all. I want to be part of those plans. And so today I mentioned the Modiste.
Yes.
We're going to talk about Elizabeth Keckley. Who was a slave, who was a craftsman.
Yes.
She was a seamstress,
yes.
Even a designer, but
yes.
called a modiste.
Yes. And so her story is impeccable, and I'm so excited to share with you all today about her story. So she actually, with her skillful hands, rose to prominence from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., and became the actual modiste, the dressmaker of Mary Todd Lincoln.
The Mary Todd Lincoln.
Yes. So that's Abraham Lincoln's wife. And so there's also a book, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be based on that book. And it is called Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave, 40 Years in the White House. And it was published in 1868.
Now, this is her story in this book, which I can only imagine in that year, in that era, was both dangerous and rare.
Absolutely. So it was actually a controversial book at that time. So you have a lot of the accounts that I'll share with you all today about Mary Todd Lincoln's life and all the different things that she went through.
And her reaction to the book.
Exactly.
Okay, we'll get to that.
Yeah. And so it was controversial, and Elizabeth Keckley, afterwards, she actually would go on not to speak to Mary Todd Lincoln because she refused to speak to her.
All right.
So really excited to get into the book, but just to set some kind of parameters for our conversation today, there is going to be some tough history, some hard history.
Right.
You'll hear the stories of resilience, of determination, of entrepreneurship, of adaptability even, and in the face of the institution of slavery.
And you will hear a part of the story is rape.
Yes, you will hear that story, and not just once, but you'll hear that
Abuse.
Yes, that sexual assault happening to two people in particular. And so just wanting to make sure that we set those ground rules if people choose not to listen to that.
Absolutely. I always say to be mindful of your own body, your own breathing. Some of this, even though this happened in the 1800s, it is relevant today. It is history. It is our history, but it's also harsh. And can perhaps remind you of an experience you had. And so we encourage you to pause this video and come back and watch it later. If you find yourself holding your breath, I always talk about that because we don't realize that we're holding our breath when we feel tension or feel stress. So if you find yourself holding your breath or your shoulders are up, stomach feels a little ill at ease, just pause it and come back to it. Okay.
Sounds
All
good.
right.
Yeah.
Cecily?
So her story begins with her mother, Agnes or Aggie, and she's actually impregnated by her slaveholder at the time, Colonel Armistead Burwell. So Colonel Burwell, his mother actually recorded Keckley's birth in a plantation record book, and it happened during February 1818 in Virginia. So that's where she's born. Though Keckley did not necessarily... That was her biological father, but she did not consider him to be her father. But a man named George Pleasant Hobbs was considered by her and by him, George Pleasant Hobbs, to be her father. And so, the story even with George Pleasant Hobbs is one of trial as well, because for the first parts of her life, she only would see him twice a year.
He was only allowed to come. He was on another plantation.
Yes, correct. And so then eventually he moves a little bit closer, and so their family's happy. They're excited. They're like, oh, finally, she's saying I get to be around my father. And then what ends up happening is that's short-lived because actually he was sent west. And so she tells the story of that moment. And so just to give you a little sense of what she talks about, she says that the announcement fell upon the little circle in that rude lodge cabin like a thunderbolt. I can remember the scene as if it was but yesterday, how my father cried out against the cruel separation, his last kiss, his wild straining of my mother to his bosom, the solemn prayer to heaven, the tears and sobs, the fearful anguish of broken hearts, the last kiss, the last goodbye, and he, my father, was gone forever.
What is so moving about this? This is from her book.
Yes.
The book that someone recorded, her telling her stories. These are her words of what she as a child experienced when her father, all slaves, when he is sold and has to leave.
Yes. Yeah, and even at the age of 4. So the story that I didn't share quite yet is that she was working alongside her mother as a domestic servant. She was enslaved, right? And she would actually watch the Burwell's child.
At 4.
Who was 4 years old. Yeah. And so there's some instances where she talks about the harsh cruelty of enslavement during that time and how she experienced that at such a young age. And she goes on to say that Mrs. Burwell actually inflicts lashes upon her. And she says, the blows were not administered with a light hand, I assure you. And doubtless the severity of the lashes had made me remember the incident so well. This was the first time that I was punished in this cruel way, but not the last.
She's 4 years old.
Yes.
And is basically another child's nanny.
Correct.
She's a babysitter. She is a slave. Her mother is a slave.
Right.
And for whatever reason, there is no reason that makes sense to us today, she is beaten.
Yes.
By this child's mother, by the slave, the plantation owner's wife.
Yes.
As a toddler.
As a toddler, yeah. So she was rocking the cradle too hard and the child fell out of the cradle. And from there,
she was beaten. And that was, as she says in her book, first time, but not the last.
Yeah, but not the last. Yeah. And so there's other stories. So actually, Burwell would eventually give, and I'm using that language somewhat loosely, but we understand that enslavement is a hard a hard system and the cruelty of it. But at the age of 14, she was given to the oldest son of the Burwell family, and he was a Presbyterian minister.
Okay.
All right. And so at the age of 14, it was said from his wife that she wanted Elizabeth Keckley's stubborn pride to be beaten out of her.
Oh.
And so he did. On several occasions, he would punish her by beating her, and she fought back every single time. She would administer, he would administer, lashes and beating her pretty badly, and she would sustain a lot of wounds and things of that nature. But every single time, she continued to fight. And the last time that she talks about in her book, she said that he cried and said it would be a sin to beat her, and so he hadn't touched her after that.
But again, it is his wife, the minister's wife, the pastor's wife, who says she's too proud. You need to beat it out of her.
Yes. Yep. Correct. Okay. Yeah. And then there's other instances of sexual abuse. And so for 4 years by a white store merchant, she would be sexually assaulted and would give birth to her only son. And his name was George. And so, and
she never, I read that she never names him in the book.
No, so she chooses not to name him, and people do research and find out who he is eventually. But yes, I'll refrain from naming him as well.
We will honor her. We're going to honor the Modiste.
Absolutely. But at the age of 21, she would give birth to George,
and she was sexually assaulted for years.
Oh yeah, 4 years.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes.
4.
1, 2, 3, 4.
FOR.
Yes.
4. The number 4 years.
Yes, 4 years. Yeah.
Okay, so that would have started then at 17.
Yeah, so, roughly about that time, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
The fortitude of this woman,
yes.
of so many. And she's not a rarity
right.
of having been raped, abused, beaten because you're too proud, which we can come way forward to the notion that some had for a very long time that if a black person was feeling himself, if a black person thought too much of himself, that was worth a beating.
Yep, absolutely. And there are countless stories of that.
Countless stories.
Yeah. And to go on to share more about her story. So eventually she's given to another child of the Burwell family. So Anne Burwell and her husband, Hugh Garland, actually, have Elizabeth Keckly, her son, and her mother as now their enslaved labor.
Okay.
So Mr. Garland goes before them, and he's on the banks of the Mississippi River. So when the rest of the family show up, of course there's hopes right before they leave that they're going to amass some wealth, and there's so much opportunity in St. Louis, right? All of these things. When they get here, they see that he is very poor. And so the plan was to have her mother, Elizabeth Keckly's mother, who had trained her as a young child. Not only was she watching the Burwell's daughter, but she was also sewing, and that's where she learned the craft. But actually wanted the mother to be able to make some money for the family. Yeah.
So who did he lie to? Everybody. He lied to everybody.
Yes.
So this is her moving to St. Louis.
Yes. Yep. So
as an enslaved, she, her mom, and her son.
Yes. Yep. And so Hugh Garland goes before them. So when they arrive, Elizabeth Keckly talks about in the book how they found him on the banks of the Mississippi River and how he was impoverished. He was poor. And
so I don't know who hatches. Do we know who hatched the plan that, wait a minute, you all have a talent. We're going to use your talent to support us all.
Yes.
And that's actually what happened.
Yes.
So Elizabeth's mother.
Yes. They wanted her mother to do it. Elizabeth Keckly said that her mother was getting up there in age, and she couldn't fathom the fortitude of having her mother do this work on behalf of the Garland family. And so she decides to take it upon herself to ask Mr. Garland, hey, is it possible for me to be able to work on behalf of the family so that my mom doesn't have to? And he agrees. And so that's when her clientele starts to kick up in St. Louis.
Right.
And,
Because she's talented.
Yeah, she's very talented.
And it's apparent early on.
Yes, it is. And so in the book, she talks about, and I'm going to quote something for you all so that you can hear her voice and hear essentially what she's able to do. And so she says, with my needle, I kept bread in the mouths of 17 persons for 2 years and 5 months. So
17
persons.
She supported 17 people with her gift.
Yes, with her gift.
Where are the buildings named after Keckley?
Whew.
Where are the streets named after Keckley?
Yes.
Where are the designs named after? Do we know there are photos? I know. I mean, drawings.
Yes. Well, there's one dress I know of that it's been said that it was made by Keckley and it was for Mary Todd Lincoln, and it's in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
At one of the museums there. But yeah, so there has been talk of her work still circulating in the U.S.
And this is another reason why what we are doing, what you are doing for us, I should say, is so important, because I can't help but think that if more young people, middle-aged, whomever, knew that this woman raped, beaten, enslaved, supported 17 people with her gifts,
Yes.
that we would be inspired to also to also take this craftsmanship to heart, because this is who we are.
Yes.
This is who we are.
Absolutely. This is a part of our story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Where is the Keckley Scholarship to Stevens College in Columbia, Missouri? Where is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
All right.
So her story continues. So eventually she gets married. She does marry. And it's unfortunately
He lied. Go on, say it.
he presented himself to be a free person.
Cecily's so nice. He presented himself to be a free person.
Yes, he did.
That brother lied and said, I'm free.
He did.
And he was not.
No, he wasn't. And then he also had some vices too. And so she stays with him for about 8 years or so.
He was an alcoholic, I think.
I believe so, yeah. And then I
was-
think they decide to part ways.
Okay.
And so that's...
She said she'd had enough.
Yeah.
Haven't read the book yet, but that's what Elizabeth said. I've had enough.
8 years is a nice amount of time.
Yes,
And
it
she
is.
finds out that he actually is enslaved and that he had some trouble as well.
That is a Spike Lee joint right there. That is quite a movie.
Yeah.
All of this is her whole life. Her whole life.
Absolutely is, yes.
So she leaves him.
Yep. And then now she's on the venture of like, okay, I'm doing all this labor. I'm working.
I'm supporting everybody
Yeah,
around me.
I want to be free. That's
Right.
where she's at this point in her life. And so she asked Mr. Garland, hey, can I purchase my freedom? And he says, no, don't ask me again. And I'm paraphrasing, y'all. But she goes and asks him again, and he ends up giving her a quarter and says, you could take this quarter, you could take you and your son, and you can go across the river on a steamboat, and you can escape to freedom yourself and go to Illinois. And she catches on to what he's doing, and she says, no, I don't want to receive my freedom that way. I want to receive my freedom the right way, essentially, is what she says, through the
Exactly.
legal way. And so,
A lesser man
yeah.
would have, because many did, and
Right.
that doesn't make
It's
them
true.
many many
Right.
did.
It's true.
Escape, and
Yes.
then there were slave catchers.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was a looking over your shoulder life.
Yes.
and she did not want that.
Yeah, and even then, I mean, even if she was to take that quarter and go across the river, somebody could have absolutely captured her and brought her right back to Mr. Garland.
And there were those true stories of those who were born free and were captured and brought back to the South into slavery.
Absolutely.
So it didn't matter at that time,
If you had black skin, you were, whether you were free or not,
free or not.
you were susceptible to
Yeah,
anything.
absolutely.
And so,
To being kidnapped.
yeah.
Which happened again and again and again.
It did.
So she says no to him, and
Yeah.
she wants to work for it.
She does. And so what ends up happening is he agrees. He says, okay, all right, that's fine, whatever. He ends up dying. And then Mr. Burwell supported her venture to become free. And so he says, okay, you can receive your freedom, but she doesn't have the money because she's been working on behalf of the family.
She's been supporting everybody else.
Everybody else but herself. You know, she hasn't been able to get that finances up.
I can only imagine that it wasn't as if anybody was paying her and then she broke off a piece for the 17 folks. they probably took the money,
Yeah.
period. She
Yeah.
wasn't in charge of anything.
Yeah. And
I
contract
only
is
imagine.
right, and a contract is a contract. So, she could be rented off to someone, and through
Right.
that contractual,
Because she was labor. She was a commodity.
right.
Yeah.
Yep. And so sometimes they could give her a little something, but still it wasn't enough. He wanted $1,200 for her and her son. And
Which is what today?
it's about $35,000 today.
And who among us has sitting on that today?
Right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So she ends up actually being able to receive the money, but she insists it is a loan from some of her clientele in St. Louis. And
So some of her white clientele help her.
yeah, yep, they do. They help her. So they front her the money, and she takes 5 years to get
Pay them
enough
all
money
back.
to pay them all back.
Mm.
Yeah. And from there, that's when, and so she's about 37 or so when she is emancipated, her and her son. And she decides she's going to go east.
Okay. Where does she go?
She goes to Baltimore.
Now we're getting closer to Mary Todd Lincoln, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Yep. So she goes to Baltimore and she's there for about 6 weeks. And what ends up happening is she wants to essentially teach Black women how to sew. And she runs out of money. And so she has just enough money to make it to Washington, D.C. And there's some things in Washington, D.C. that she had to account for. Like there was a license that was needed if you were going to be there. I think it was, you couldn't stay there no longer than 10 days without the license. So she figures out a way to get the license, and now she's there. And she's sewing for some of the more prominent women in Washington, D.C. at that particular time. So the wives of Jefferson Davis and Stephen Douglas, and I'll specifically spend a little bit more time on Jefferson Davis's wife, just to give you a little
And
context.
Jefferson Davis is.
Yeah, so he's the president of the Confederate States between 1861 and 1865. So these are the type of people that she's frequenting and she's around and she's sewing for and providing for their family.
High profile.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so so at the time, when Keckley was in D.C., Jefferson Davis would have been considered the senator of Mississippi at that particular time. And his wife, Verena Davis, hires Keckley. And so she would hear them talk about what she called the prospects of war. And so she knew that there was some buzzing, right, happening.
Something big's about to happen.
Something's going to happen.
Yeah.
And they didn't necessarily know what was going on at that particular time, but she heard of the prospects of war. And so Verena actually asked Keckley, "Hey, Keckley, do you want to come on down to the South with us?" Yes.
Say no, Elizabeth. Say don't answer the phone. They're in the house.
And the interesting...
I'm sorry. This is not even funny at all, but it is funny.
Yeah, and it's interesting
Like the
because
nerve.
Yeah, because she tells Keckley that the Southern soldiers will fight to conquer. And she's saying that the South is going to win, right? So you got to think about it at the time.
Yeah.
You have both sides thinking like, hey, if this war is going to happen, we got to be the victors of this thing. And so she's trying to convince Keckley, the South is going to win, right?
But Keckley knows.
Keckley knows something.
Because I've been there. I've been in the South. I don't want to go back there.
Yeah, she knows something.
What does she say?
So she ends up saying in her book, "I prefer to cast my lot among the people of the North. I parted with Miss Davis kindly, half promising to join her in the South if further deliberation should induce me to change my views."
Now, here's my observation about that statement. The parted kindly is shocking. Because I even the asking her to come is shocking. Because they could have forced her.
True.
They could have, that was happening in that era. They could have forced her. So I'm stunned and I'm happy that the parting was kind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Me too. And when they do part ways and they go south, the Davises go south, then Keckley's clientele starts to really elevate. So she's producing in such a way in which she's having a hard time keeping up. And there's one particular client who says, well, hey, I need you to get this dress made in 1 week. And Keckley's like, man, I got all these clients. I got all these dresses I got to make. There's no way. She said, I will give you, there's a benefit
And what
this.
what is the enticement?
The enticement is I will put you in contact with the Mary Todd Lincoln.
Oh,
And so things work itself out, and she's actually able to
get this dress done in a week.
yeah, get it done. And she meets Mary Todd Lincoln. Things work out. There's some other things that transpire, but nevertheless, she does become the modiste of Mary Todd Lincoln.
And how long was she the dressmaker for?
I believe a few years.
My goodness.
Yeah, a few years. So she would live to actually witness their son, Willie, transition, pass away in 1862. And she understood that grief very well.
She lost her son.
Yeah, she did. And he was actually passing as a white man during the Battle of Wilson's Creek near Springfield. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. And so she understood that grief.
Springfield, Missouri.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes. Springfield, Missouri. She understood that grief very well because she had too experienced the loss of a child, and her only child at that. And then she lives through the passing and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So she's seeing all of these things happen. So she was very close to Mary Todd Lincoln.
My goodness. And we'll put just a brief pin that you did get to go to Springfield, Missouri.
Yes.
Because they, Elizabeth Keckley's son is buried in a mass grave.
Yes, correct. Yep. And so they put up a headstone in his honor in recognition of what he did in battle, to just reflect on that moment in history and time. And, it's important.
It is important.
And so, yep, I was able to go. So history isn't that far away. It's not that far removed.
Not at all. Not at all.
This is a story in which we can really see that.
And so she lives through all of these. This is a tumultuous time.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, she goes on to become, and this is through Mary Todd Lincoln, the presiding officer of the Contraband Relief Association of Washington, D.C. in 1862. So she was actually supporting some of the formerly enslaved people who were who had self-emancipated at that time. And, then she's contacted by a press company who says, hey, we want to hear your story. And from there, that's when she tells her story. And there's pieces of the book that she talks about were not supposed to be published in print.
And that is about Mary Todd Lincoln, perhaps?
Yeah, yeah. And so she's really upset that it happens that way because, as I said, Mary Todd Lincoln completely stops talking to her. And so she ends up, she goes off to Ohio, and she's the head of Wilberforce University's Sewing and Domestic Science Arts Department, and that's in 1892. And then she actually suffers a stroke and then has to return back to Washington, D.C., where she spends the rest of her life in an institution which she co-founded, and that's the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children. And then she would eventually pass away in 1907 at the age of 89 years old.
And I looked up the average lifespan for Black people in that time. And I want to say that it was 30, maybe 31 or 32. Something. It was very, very young.
Yeah.
So for her to live that long is remarkable.
Yes, absolutely. So you got to think about what she was able to not only experience, but what she saw, right? And what she created. Right. And
so she's co-founding the home.
Yes.
She twice now was teaching other people this craft, which is a craft to this day.
It really is.
And this is one thing that I'm not frustrated by it, but I want us to have a greater sense of the things we did with our hands, with our minds, and with our hearts, and be inspired by that. Rather than to think if you making millions as a football player, God bless you. But you can also make a very good living as a modiste.
Yes.
Please do, because there's history that shows you the way.
On the very grounds that we walk.
On the very grounds that we walk.
Yes.
My goodness.
Yeah.
I love this story because the fortitude that she had to have. And we don't even know, is it in, you don't have to tell me this, but I'm curious too, when does she find out her son is passing? And her son would have to, in order to pass, you have to cut off the relationship. So do you not
Right.
talk to your mom anymore?
Yeah.
Do you become a whole new person and you never see your mom again? And how does she feel about that? I have so many questions.
So he does take the name of the white store merchant
Who raped her?
Kirkland is the, so that's his last name. And so I said I wasn't going to talk about
It's okay. You didn't say the first name.
but so George Kirkland is his name and the son's name. And so that's how he's able to pass, was through that last name.
And the talk about looking over your shoulder.
Yeah.
The fear that you would have to have and the boldness
Yes.
you would have to try to pass as white, because you know if you are found out,
Yes.
that's jail or certain death.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to have to look up the dress so I can see it. We do have some photos that we're showing you as we talk about this, but I so enjoyed this story, and even as difficult and horrific as her life was, she managed to make such a difference in the lives of so many.
Absolutely, yes. And I'm so fortunate to be able to share stories like Elizabeth Keckley's story.
Well, we are going to continue to do this, and I'm so grateful. I had this wild idea that, we're talking about the question of how did we get here on this podcast all the time, and that's really about history. So why not partner with one of the greatest museum organizations, if you will, in the country, and that is the Missouri Historical Society, and all the great work that you're doing at the Missouri History Museum. Cecily, thank you.
Thank you.
You're going to come back in a couple of weeks and tell us another story?
Absolutely.
I love it. Story time. Cecily Hunter is the public historian of the African American History Initiative at the Missouri Historical Society, the Missouri History Museum, as you know it, and you love it. Thank you again.
No problem. Thank you.
We'll be back with more Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. Thank you so much.